The first time I saw him was over 3 years ago. He was a part of a crowd on a subway that I saw as I sat leaving on the train. At first I could only make out the abstract expressions, his details being far too away to clearly register. It was clear from the singular observation, however, that something was horribly wrong. His face was twisted into an excessive grin, one that failed to imply true enthusiasm or happiness, but instead was glaringly artificial, as if to deliberately catch a close observer off guard to reel them in. His face stretched impossibly wide, his eyes wincing and looking at me if they were subtly attempting to hide a malevolent intent. His face disturbed me, but I assumed it was a simple aberration at first. However, the man continued to look at me, glaring a grotesque smile. Each time I rode, he seemed to grow closer to the train, until he was eventually staying so close to the tracks that he could nearly be run over. However, everyone there seemed to not care. It wasn't as if he didn't exist. They still made the tiny interactions every average person did, but they showed no fear in his expression or in his dangerous actions. This continued for over a year until he began to appear inside the train itself. I can still clearly remember the first day. I saw him seat himself and stand in a completely unnatural sitting posture, completely turned at 90-degree angles and unrelaxed. It was on the other side, and half a dozen seats away, but I could make out his face with ease now. He looked both far too young and far too old. I could honestly say he was either 20 or 60, that's how hard it was to tell. Staying closer, I could see his grin, the almost apparent pain he seemed to feel with his unnatural smile and deranged, bloodshot eyes. His face was tightly wrinkled, not naturally, but as a result of how far his face was from being stretched. He could have almost been conventionally attractive if he was making normal facial expressions, but he had twisted himself into one of the most hideous I had ever seen. His hair was brown, slightly receded, but long and curly and parted in the middle. His legs were also abnormally short, and he could barely touch the floor in the seat he was in. I tried to look away again, but he continued to draw my attention. I could tell he was staring at me, but I didn't wish to break the peace of the train ride. He looked gleeful at my intense discomfort, and I could swear that I could see his neck leaning slightly forwards. The charade continued, so he would continue to sit in different random places, but always with the same unnatural posture and the same red and burning face. I began considering the sheer unlikelihood of us both attending this exact card at the exact same time. He already followed me at first, but in many cases he had already seated himself wherever he was, and I would only notice it a few minutes afterwards. I always noticed it, though. Even when I tried to walk the 3-mile hike to work, I would see him, in the crowd, or in a taxi or in a restaurant, never having noticed his food, but always sitting at a table with a view of the outside, staring at me. His specimens had grown from unsettling to downright predatory. I attempted to charge into the restaurant at one point, beg him to stop, but when I went over to his table, he was simply gone, and no one had ever reported seeing him, any who assembled in the establishment. I looked through thousands of files in the saddest dangerous registries, but nobody's face appeared to line up with him in the slightest. I had abandoned all hope of discovering his intentions when something happened that would cause situations to go from bad to drastically worse. I'd been first to work the late shift at my job, and by the time I was done it was nearly 12 a.m. The metro at this point was nearly empty, and when I got into the train, I was the only person in my cart. As I sat down, I heard the thin breaths of an inhuman thing, and gradually turned to see another person, looking in a different direction, who was only 2 seats away from me. Dread sat in my stomach, as their face slowly, mechanically turned to confirm what I had subconsciously already known. I was no more than 5 feet away from the man that had tormented my mind, every inch and detail of his face clearly visible. So close to the man, I could tell he was anything but. His face was too unnatural, too rubbery, his teeth lacking the grit or reflectiveness of a person, and instead completely bland and plastic. I jumped out of my seat, screaming, but no one could hear me as the other cars as we traveled deep under the metro. As I attempted to back away, the man just sat there with the same malevolent grin washed upon his face. I could only meagerly out a few words. Why? Why are you doing this? He took nearly a dozen seconds for any response, only for his mouth to open, exposing his completely black throat. He had no tongue, eulabial, or flesh, only complete and utter blackness expanding down the infinite expanse of his inner mouth. Harsh, breathy moan responded. At a labored pace. I screamed at him for more answers, but he could only continue with this desperate charade. escaped his lips, or pulses his lips, yet again, stabbing any hopes I had for a coherent answer. I swung my fist as hard as I could at him, yet he was absolutely unaffected. I began punching him over and over again, with extreme force, lunging upon him and attacking his stomach and groin for any type of response, but nothing happened. The text reflected off his overly shiny skin, leaving absolutely no indentation or notice of attack. I could see now that his clothes didn't budge, instead they're completely fused to his skin. I screamed at the top of my lungs again. I heard him finally whisper another word. The word was just as useless, just as meaningless, cruel, and arbitrary. I flung myself outside the metro as soon as I could and ran as fast as I ever ran in my entire life, nearly toppling another person. I ran up the stairs to my apartment and locked it absolutely shut. I began to hear a low, dulcet tone. A continuous whisper, like a movie version of a snake. As I shone my phone's flashlight across my apartment, I swore what I swore to God couldn't have been. He had somehow beat me to my own apartment and was standing in my living room, the exact center of my apartment, staring at me. As I walked, with horror and fear and trepidation in my step, his body perfectly rotated, not even shuffling those legs, but rotated without any external movements. I ran to the apartment door, trying to force it open, but it refused to move. I could see that he was slowly approaching me, so I jumped and kicked him directly in the face, went into my bedroom and slamming the door shut and locked. As he began to stand up as if nothing had happened, I rammed my wardrobe over the door and called 911 as fast as I could. The police arrived 2 hours later, breaking down my apartment door, but immediately afterwards, I heard the low rattling of multiple death gurgles. I looked outside my bedroom's peephole to see the man standing over the collapsed bodies of the emergency force of over half a dozen men that had been sent in. He continued to stare at me. Again, continuing his monotonous, cruel, dread-inducing drone. After 30 minutes, I could hear the sounds of my door being fiddled with. Looking outside the peephole to see his face staring at me in a greater expression of hate than anything I had ever seen. The sound of transforming painfully slowly into the distorted gurgles of I can tell he's close to opening my bedroom door now. My best bet is likely to jump outside of my window and hope I can survive the 3-story fall. Almost wordlessly, I've realized something. He wanted me to do this. By sharing this with you, I've invited this man's form into your head. Stop listening to the story now, and stop thinking about him forever. It's the only way you can possibly stay safe. I regret thee dearly for exposing you to this thing and whatever it had planned for me and you, but it's too late. I've attempted to delete this video numerous times, but my work keeps forcing me to bear my thoughts onto the video, and bear his form. He forced me to take a picture of his form, and as I speak now, his image is being exposed. Please, don't look at the screen.